people are going to tape and use this for further training. So I had to edit out one story that I usually tell. But other than that, it should be pretty much what we've been doing at North Chicago in terms of training our mental health staff to use the Global Assessment of Functioning scale. First of all, did everyone receive the materials that Mike sent? Anyone who didn't?
You got it.
They did.
I'm sorry, one place? Was there one site that didn't receive the materials?
Sounds okay, George.
Okay. So everyone should have a copy of the VHA directive on the Global Assessment of Functioning. You've got an article by Michael First called Mastering DSM-4 Axis 5. And you've got case examples from John Simpson and Brockton IPCC staff. These are good examples. We've used them in most of our training. They have produced some fairly violent disagreements. John indicated in an email that they've changed a few of the ratings, and some of our people will be happy with that. There's a lot of ambiguity in the ratings as you really begin to look at them closely. Thanks for those case examples, John, and also the copies, the laminated copies you have of the GAF scale. This is an adaptation of the Global Assessment of Functioning scale that we did at North Chicago. Diana Pure, who usually presents GAF programs with me, is getting surgery today, so she couldn't be here. She volunteered to put off her surgery, but going anyway, so she did a lot of work on putting together the scale and also some of the training components that we use. A disclaimer here, I guess, on the scale. It is printed and laminated, but that doesn't make it the last word on the GAF. What we did is to add in some explanatory examples and descriptions that mostly in the 1 to 50 section of the scale, looking at the seriously mentally ill. Just because for our VA population, these are a lot of the people that we're looking at. We did do some corrections on the upper end of the scale too, and we also added some instructions on how to use the scale.
A whole lot of.
I'm sorry?
I think that was an open microphone.
Okay. We added on the, if you look at your scale, the laminated copies, you can see that you have on one side you have the first half of the scale, on the other side the second half. I think my printer printed them upside down, but so you have to turn them over for some of you. But this is essentially the...
Very good. Does that other one work better?
The thing I want you to look at first on the GAF scale is to notice at the bottom, on the first side, 1 to 50, that we've indicated some areas for disability. Below 35, it says totally disabled. 1 to 50, seriously mentally ill. And these are kind of yardsticks that we're seeing used increasingly. And with the VERA requirements for the VA to define the seriously mentally ill population, most likely that's what they're going to be looking at. People with GAF scores below 50. And for disability, we're seeing, for 100% disability, we're seeing the number of 35, below 35 being used as a kind of a rough indicator of disability for some of our comp and pen people that go for comp and pen exams. So those are important to keep in mind. To realize that somebody who's above 35, may not be qualifying any longer for 100% disability. So you have to really be careful when you're doing your ratings. For today, what we're going to do is review use of the GAF in VA. We're going to look at the mechanics of using the scale. We're going to work through some case examples. Just to start off, the GAF overall, when it began to rise in prominence for us in the past year, a lot of people said, "Oh, this is a terrible instrument. It shouldn't be used for anything." And why in heck did VA ever choose to use it? And I'm not going to give my story of how I think the central office reaches a decision to use the GAF. But it does do a couple of things that are important. It has some strengths. The GAF scale allows you to get a good ballpark estimate of someone's overall level of functioning. So if I say to you that somebody has a GAF of 14, that's going to give you some information. You're going to know probably be able to say something about the type of living environment that they're in. Somebody for a 14 might be in a hospital setting. They could be in IPCC with intensive case management. They might be in a partial or day hospital. But just knowing that, just from that one number, you have some information. And if you also have the highest GAF for the patient the past year, that can tell you how far someone is away from their baseline functioning. The Global Assessment of Functioning scale, I think, as everyone is aware, just let me review it briefly for people who aren't. It's the scoring goes from 1 to 100, and it's in ranges of 10. So the scoring for anyone on the GAF can range in there. We used to have a lot of people putting 0 in for a GAF, and that's no longer accepted. It has to be a number between 1 and 100. The Veterans Eligibility Reform Act of 1996 requires that the VA maintain the capacity to provide specialized treatment rehabilitative needs for disabled veterans. For us, seriously mentally ill population is who we're looking at. And in order to establish a baseline, VHA decided to use GAF scores in fiscal year 1998. So I think most of us have been trying to enter GAF scores. The GAF scores are entered in the patient treatment file with the discharge summary. So for all inpatients, for most of us, they've been getting GAF scores for quite a while. For outpatients in North Chicago, we've been entering the GAF scores for our patients into the outpatient mental health file. So that we've got most of them entered at this point. And the expectation was that all veterans receiving mental health services would have at least one GAF during fiscal year 98. The other thing is that in addition to establishing a baseline, the GAF is being used by VA as a performance measure. So in addition to maintaining the capacity to provide the specialized treatment services, there's also an expectation with this DHA directive that the average GAF score from fiscal year 1999 to 2003 is going to go up by 5%. So that means 5 points on the GAF scale. So for everybody who got a GAF in fiscal year 1998, we're expecting that by 2003, that GAF will have moved 5 points. One difficulty with that is that the GAF scale isn't really that sensitive. For anyone that's used it, you realize that it is numerical, and it allows you to get a number and do some statistical manipulations that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But the distinctions between a 32 and a 34 are pretty hard to justify. But the fact that it's being used as a performance measure means that we have to take it very seriously. It's also being used for some of the clinical guidelines for mental health, the major depressive disorder guidelines. The first measures that they used in this past year included the GAF scores. So they looked at the patient treatment file and they looked for GAF scores to see about the implementation of major depressive disorder. And I think for the psychosis guidelines, which are also going to be implemented this year, the GAF plays a role there also. The output for the GAF, I mentioned earlier, is going to be in two places. It's going to be in your patient treatment file. That's going to be generated from the discharge summary for inpatients and in the mental health package. All sites should have the mental health package, and most of the updates on it have been entered. So when you look at the mental health package in your computer, you'll see a section for GAF scores, and it's really easy to enter them in there, and it gives you a good profile for your individual patients. It also allows you to track how you're doing in terms of collecting GAF scores for your outpatients. The laminated copy that you have of the GAF scale, we're going to start with that. And I'm going to do one thing that I always do, but that is almost never successful. We've never had more than 40% of people that we've trained be able to actually accomplish this procedure that we're going to do. But since we designed this as a pocket-sized scale, I'm going to at least give it a try and see what we can do. But let me say, first of all, if you don't want to use the laminated scale as a pocket scale, you can just leave it flat as it is. But for those of you who actually want to use it in the pocket-sized version, what you need to do right now is take the GAF scale in both hands and hold it out in front of you. Okay, I can hear a few papers rustling. It's out in front of you. Now what I want you to do is push your hands together very slowly, and what will happen is your GAF scale will start to crunch up a little bit, and when the edges are just about equal, fold it down. Hold it flat and press it down. And what you should have is a trifold scale that'll just fold it up and then unfold it, and you can carry it around with you. One of the reasons, was everybody successful on that?
No.
Still working on it. I've done this, we've probably done 10 or 12 of these training sessions, and you can stand right up in front of a group of people and demonstrate how to do it, and you still don't do any better than 4 out of 10 people. But it really does fold nicely so you can carry it around. And the reason we wanted to be able to do that is because for the Global Systems Functioning Scale, it has a problem kind of built into it, and that is that its reliability is not really too good. So that in two ways, the inter-rater reliability and the intra-rater reliability. So if I do a GAF rating today, and then I do for the same patient a couple of weeks from now, chances are that I'm going to have some error in there. And for us, we found the error was about plus or minus 10. So you could have an error of a whole range just rating it yourself. And if you take a group of people and train them, what we found was that we started out definitely with plus or minus 10. And with the training, we were able to get it down to plus or minus 5, so that most people would be within about a 5-point range in their ratings. The difficulty is that unless you do some regular retraining just to keep your reliability up, it's going to begin to drift. At North Chicago, we did our GAF ratings on all of our patients together and decided why a person would fit at exactly what score. And then a few months later, as we looked at it, we could see some drift. The people's opinions had changed. The information that they were taking into account was a little bit different. So we had to then take a look and say, okay, now what are the real factors here? What are the symptoms we're looking at, and where should we be, and then kind of change it. Several people noticed last year when we first began to look at the GAF scores that we had for IPCC, we had several people that were 70 or 80, and it wasn't uncommon at our medical center to have a fair number of patients in that 70 to 80 range. And for the seriously mentally ill population, it wouldn't be very likely that they would be up that high in the range. So what we were doing, I think, is what most people have historically done with the GAF scale. You look at someone's functioning and take an overall look and see what's what's the best level they're at, and you probably give them that highest score. So you take the best element of your functioning because you want to see improvement, and then use that for your GAF score. And there's some difficulties with that, particularly if you're using it as a measure, as we are, to define our seriously mentally ill population. If you go ahead and use the best elements of someone's functioning, you may place them at a 70. If you look at the worst elements of their functioning, that may place them below 50.
What do you have, a screwdriver?
Are you listening to
Somebody have a question, or are they just talking in the background?
Yeah, whoever that is, just turn your microphone off, okay?
So, as you're going along, making a rating, you can have real wide variations in your symptoms versus your level of functioning. The training that we did on this started with Michael First's article, and he gives in the article a very simple way of looking at symptom severity and level of functioning. And that's what we expanded on in our training and with the modification of the scale that we use. You can see on the back of the scale, the last half of it, the instructions that we give, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on those. First, just the mechanics of doing the scale. The first thing we're saying is to look at symptom severity and read the description of the description and the clinical examples that are listed, and look to see where your patient fits. And then the next thing you want to do is try to decide, are they in the low, medium, or high area of that section. And then you give a score for symptom severity, a GAF score for symptom severity. And then you do the same thing for level of functioning. You read the examples, look at the descriptions, and give a score. You're looking, again, low, medium, and high. Where's the person fit in the range? And then give them a score. So now you have a level of functioning score and a symptom severity score. You look at those, and whichever one is the lowest is going to be your GAF. And that's essentially the system. And it works very well if you do it this way, if you split it up. If you pay a lot of attention to it and try to really analyze each individual section, it breaks down fairly quickly, because some of the descriptions of symptom severity or level of functioning are not as clear as they might be. So, as with most clinical material, you want to have probably at least 2 or 3 pieces of evidence that would place a person into that particular range of the scale in order to make a good judgment about it. We also included something on the other side of the scale, the 1 to 50 side, called treatment parameters. And this is just kind of a help guide to give you an idea of where somebody in that range of the scale might be housed. So if you, we do something here, I don't know if everyone is doing it with CQI training, but we have a training program that includes a game called CQI Jeopardy, where you pick a quality assurance area from a board, and there's an answer, and then you have to come up with a question, and you get points for that, and win the game if you know all the CQI data. You can do the same thing with the GAF. So if you think about it as a Jeopardy scoreboard, you think that the answer to your question that's on the board is Joe has a GAF of 14. The question is, what hospital is Joe in? With a 14, he could very well be in a hospital. Or let's suppose the answer is Joe has a GAF of 95. What is Joe doing in the mental health clinic is the question with a 95. He doesn't need to be there. Or suppose the answer is Joe has a GAF of 50. The question might be, what kind of serious mental illness does Joe have? You're looking just at the global basics, and with the treatment parameters, you can also do that. You're, as I mentioned earlier, looking at 35 as a point of total disability. That's also a point where people could be in a hospital. If they have a GAF over 35, it's fairly unlikely that they'll be in a psychiatric hospital. They may be in a substance abuse treatment program, some kind of residential program. But it becomes less and less likely with 35 that someone's going to stay in the hospital very long. So you know that just from the score of 35. And you can consider, too, as you go up on the other side of the scale, the 51 to 100, that as you get into the 70s, the symptoms are pretty transient, and it's a range of the scale where somebody might be on medication for depression, something like that, but probably not. As you go back down the scale further, it becomes more and more likely that medication is going to be involved, and that can be an indicator kind of where somebody might fall on the scale. If somebody is living independently, that also tells you that on the scale they're probably going to be above 50. It's not too likely that somebody's going to be totally independent below 50. With supportive services, they may be doing very well, but the supportive services are kind of allowing their functioning to stay up there. Some of these things are fairly technical considerations, so that you've got some big questions to address, particularly in the VA as we think about disability. Some of the clinical examples we're going to use are going to illustrate some of these kind of abstract problems that you run into as you begin to score people. Probably the best way to start with that is to just consider one patient that we had at North Chicago VA who was schizophrenic and had lived with his parents until the time that they died, and he was now in his 50s, and he'd had a couple of hospitalizations, like one about every 10 years. So he was living with his family. So he seemed fairly independent until you realize all the things that the family had been doing for him. And this is somebody that was not above 50. He was well below 50, but his family had kept him up, kept his functioning up pretty well. But his symptoms were still a problem. So in rating him, you'd have to really think about to some extent how he might look without the supportive services. What's the underlying symptom severity, the underlying level of functioning, to really get at where you want to put him on the scale. Medication is also an issue. If someone is on a major psychiatric medication and they're not having hallucinations or delusions, they're being supported by the medication, does that mean that their functioning is in the 70 to 80 range, or does it mean they're below 50? Kind of depends on how you think about the illness that they have. And schizophrenia, for instance, isn't something that goes away to any great extent. So if you're scoring somebody who's schizophrenic up in 70 to 80 range, it's kind of questionable exactly how that would work. But I don't have any answers for that. I don't think anyone who uses the scale has any great answers of how you make those distinctions. You have to talk about them and think about them until some more research is done on the scale and some clear guidelines are available. These issues aren't going to be decided. the PTSD is another example of something that's difficult to resolve with the GAF scores. If you have a PTSD patient who's had some inpatient treatment for PTSD, was functioning at a fairly high level, and then had his symptoms, and is now on 100% disability for PTSD, and for a couple of years has been getting along, gradually built back up into a part-time job, and is social functioning is pretty decent. Is that now going to raise him above 50, or is he going to be going to remain at that 35 or below range for 100% disability? People who treat PTSD here at North Chicago have said, in their opinion, that the factors that are allowing the person to function are that the level of stress has been minimized in their life, so they're able to function. But you add the stress back in, and you'll see the symptoms come back. So careful management of stress level has upped their functioning, but their underlying symptoms may not have changed all that much, and thus they might remain 35 or below. Now, those are the kind of issues that you'll run into as you begin scoring the GAF.
So maybe you put him at a 35 or you put him at a 50?
We're going to start with some case examples, and the one I'd like you to look at first.
Excuse me, George, you want to ask and see if there's any questions?
Oh, yeah, that would be fine.
Yes, people have some particular points, and if it's something specific around it, one of these debatable points that maybe the cases will do it. But if you have any things, points of clarification, this is a good time to ask.
This is Barb Cook in Canandaigua. I just want to make sure I'm understanding right. Is the implication then, if there are obvious supports in place that are helping the person's level of function, that you would look at the person's level of function if some of these supports weren't available? Medication, structured living situations, that sort of thing?
I'm suggesting that you look at that perspective. And that's my point of view in using the GAF. And I'm not sure that there'd be total agreement with that. But I'm just saying to you, keep that in mind. Take a look at that and see if it fits. In some cases, it might not fit. In others, it might be an important consideration. But that one I don't have any great body of evidence to back that up. So it really is, it's in the category of things to think about.
Andy? Hello?
Hello. Somebody else with a question?
This is John Simpson in Brockton. One thing we struggled with here was how to define the current period of time. If you're thinking of rating functioning and symptoms during the current just for the current level, how do you define the word current?
Well, DSM-4 doesn't do that. They don't give you a specific time frame for rating the GAF. And the difficulty that you're talking about, John, is this. You have somebody who comes into, let's say, one of the examples Michael first gives is he's got a 35-year-old advertising executive, borderline personality. She cuts her wrists after the man whom she usually spends the weekend with informs her that he doesn't want to see her again. So she goes into the hospital, and her GAF on admission is 17. Now, there we assume that they're looking at her current symptoms. She's got a suicide attempt. Now, symptom severity, that sounds fine, 17. However, her level of functioning is probably considerably higher if you look at, let's say you look at how she's been functioning in the past month. She's been working, they don't say here, but it's likely that she's been doing pretty well. So she could well be have been close in terms of functioning to her highest GAF in the past year, which they tell us was 65. So she could easily be in the 60s there with level of functioning, if you consider looking at her level of functioning over a period of time. If what you do instead, if you just take a look at her functioning the exact minute that she is brought into the hospital with her suicide attempt, if you just look at her level of functioning, during that hour or 2 hours before, then her level of functioning is probably going to be fairly low. I think with level of functioning, what you have to think about is that as opposed to just an individual symptom or behavior, a level of functioning is really an integrated behavior pattern. So that holding a job means that you have to wake up on time, you have to think about getting to work, you have to actually do your job when you get there. All kinds of things have to happen that are integrated into holding a job. And they wouldn't be things necessarily that you could look at over the course of an hour or two. So somebody's level of functioning would probably involve a longer period of time. But you have to have that in mind a little bit when you're doing the GAF rating, how you're viewing it. Symptom severity would also have the same kind of a problem. If you looked at somebody's immediate symptom, on a given hour of a given day, it might be markedly different. Whereas if you looked at, say, their symptom severity over a period of a couple of days or something, you'd have a little bit broader range to work with. Since we don't have any real instruction with that in terms of how we're using the scale as part of DSM-4, I think you have to. The best way that I can work with it is to think of the level of functioning as something that's integrated and occurring over a kind of a broader range of time and space, and symptom severity as possibly something that's a little closer to more immediate. So it might be something that's within, you might think of over the past week or something like that. Is that how you guys do it, or you work with it differently?
I'm trying to remember exactly what we did. I think maybe we agreed to define it as functioning and symptoms over the last month. So I'm looking around the table here to see if people are nodding. I believe so. One thing that matters to GAF, even in terms of symptoms, is the degree to which they influence the behavior. And some of these guys, some days, they might have hallucinations, but they're not really influencing the behavior. And other days, when you see them, they might it might be a real problem. So it kind of depends on exactly when you catch them. So to try to take that into consideration, I think we did agree we'd look over the last month and consider that to be the current level.
Right. We had a patient today that we were discussing in our IPCC meeting. Yesterday, he came into the hospital, and the psychiatrist said, well, I saw him walking across the parking lot. He was talking to himself, and he was, laughing and going on and on. The pharmacist saw him in the mental health clinic, and she said, this is the worst I've ever seen this guy. He was terrible. He was talking about all kinds of different things, and he was really out of it. And somebody else said, well, I talked to him yesterday for about a half hour or so, and he's the best I've ever seen him. So with this guy, I think your only salvation is to look at a longer period of time. Because here's somebody that had very dramatically different symptoms in the course of probably 5 or 6 hours.
This is Nancy from... that's some of my concern about the GAS is some of the issues you've raised about what time frame you look at and also whether you include other features that really aren't written in there, like do they need structured living, do they need antipsychotic medication. It would be really great if someday it was revised enough to include those things so we could be sure everybody was doing it uniformly. My concern is that we have, primarily in our IPCC, we have schizophrenia and bipolar patients, which in some ways vary differently. The schizophrenic may have a somewhat narrow range of its GAS functioning, and the bipolar individual may go 9 or 10 months and be fine, and then the next weekend be standing out in the middle of the freeway. And yet, I'm very concerned about this trend of how the GAS is used on the outpatient for what you're saying, for the reevaluation of comp and pension, when we as clinicians aren't really sure we want to be seen to have it used that way, and I've never heard of how those scores have been interpreted by comp and pension before, like you've told us today. Frankly, I don't give many patients that are outpatient under 35, and yet I had no awareness that might affect what they get in terms of a reeval on their comp and pension.
Right. When we talked with when we were training our PTSD staff here, they just exploded when they realized the implications of the scoring and what seemed to be going on with the disability. I think that's why the training on the GAF is important, because you have to realize how it's being used at different levels. It's being used as a performance measure. On one hand, it's creeping into disability evaluation. It's being used as an overall base for defining the seriously mentally ill population, and it's going to have an impact on how our funding is done. And a lot of people say, well, this instrument can't support all this stuff. And as we go through the examples, I think it'll point out how that's true. It's just not a fine enough instrument to be able to make the kind of distinctions we're asking it to. So it's something to really be careful with, I think.
Yeah, this is Mike. I am also reluctant to get, I don't want to go off too far of a tangent, but this is a big issue, and I don't want our folks feeling, hey, this is going to make a total life or death issue. One of the things is that these evaluations should, if they're going to have input from our teams and our staff, should be a little more complicated than here's the number. And I would recommend a note that would say, this is the level of functioning, not just a number, but the kinds of things that are going on with or without us, and basically saying that without our support, this is where things seem to be, and with it, it seems to be at this level. But to make it certainly a little more complicated and complex representation of the clinical work and what your assessment is, and certainly not rely just on a number.
Right, and you can aid that process by splitting it up into symptom severity and level of functioning.
Right.
We also...
I think the previous caller's point is well taken, that just as we feel like patients who are taking medications have a better level of functioning with the medication rather than without, so also the compensation, that's a source of income that allows them to maintain a certain level of functioning. And I think having some reference to what might be without the IPCC support versus what it is with the IPCC support would be important to know.
Yes, it would be. Unfortunately, once you put the number down, you lose those kinds of distinctions. That's why what I was suggesting was the level of functioning, in a sense, can be corrected by looking at the symptom severity. The level of functioning with that IPCC support and with, say a new medication, somebody starts on olanzapine and their functioning jumps up, their level of functioning looks real good. But their underlying symptom severity, you might still look at that as being lower.
It would be interesting to see what kind of bias would come into clinicians' rating, knowing that this would be influencing service-connected disability.
Yeah, it would be really interesting. And I think that's what our PTSD people were thinking as they took the training.
Well, that's just a point where it's hitting home maybe a little bit sooner. The bigger question is what impact does it have that there's a specific goal that this is supposed to increase by 5% in 5 years?
Right. You got an instrument that has a reliability of plus or minus 10, let's say, and you're looking for a 5-point difference, and that can be explained just on the poor reliability of the measure.
Why do it?
You want to go on and do some case examples? Now we got about half an hour, so I want to make sure you get that covered.
Yeah, let me just mention one more thing in terms of the splitting the scores into symptom severity and level of functioning. We did a study of our IPCC GAF scores, and looking at when people entered IPCC 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and we tracked their symptom severity and level of functioning, and what we saw was that with the level of functioning was higher than the symptom severity, and it tended to increase more over time, whereas the symptom severity also got a little bit better, but not quite as much as level of functioning. So that's something just to think about when you're looking at change in your own IPCC patient group. Okay, on to the case examples.
Can I ask one question
Sure.
before we start? What do you do when the discharge GAF seems incredibly high? For example, the rating is like 50 by the inpatient staff, and we see the same individual symptom severity and level of function at probably 24.
Right. What we did for that, the thing we did when we began to look at our GAF scores, immediately we realized they were way off in that direction, and we did training with our whole vision to try to get each hospital to begin to change their scores, because these scores are going to be looked at vision-wide as well as in your medical center or in your program. So the solution to that is really training people, particularly people that are doing the discharge summaries, making sure they've had the GAF training so that they can appreciate the two aspects of the scale, the symptom severity and level of functioning, and that they're not just picking the highest level of functioning. I did the GAF for years and years before looking at this kind of distinction. I think most people did the same thing. You just ended up going with, you looked at the scale, and you just picked out the highest level, and that was your GAF. So I think that's what even there people sometimes, I think, select for that for the GAF just where they'd like the patient to be or where they think their potential is sometimes. So the training is what you can do. If you're saying, well, okay, we got somebody coming out with a 50 and we just made them a 24. How does that look? They came out of the hospital and they suddenly got twice as bad when they were in the hospital. I'm not sure that you can do anything about that, except that you can begin to, as a GAF score file begins to develop for the patient, as you enter, for outpatients, you're expected to enter the GAF every 90 days. So somebody got discharged from inpatient with a 50, and you begin tracking their outpatient GAF every 90 days, and the first rating you do is a 24, and after that, 90 days later, to 26, and then it remains 26. I think they'll gradually begin to be a correction as more correct GAFs get put in. Does that make sense?
That helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Let's start with example number 1. And this is the set of examples that's after the Michael First article. This one is Mr. A. What I'm going to do, I think, is just read through this and then ask you to score it. That would probably be the quickest way, is if I just read through it for you.
Okay, it's numbered as example number 1?
Yes.
Okay, just so people know.
Yep. You just follow along and think about your rating. Mr. A is a single veteran in his mid-60s who was admitted to the IPCC program about 2 years ago, following lengthy hospital stays and repeated failures to adjust to residential care placement. One residential care sponsor described him as being very dependent, requiring constant supervision and attention. Mr. A was rehospitalized in 1992 when he assaulted a residential care sponsor after she told him to take a shower because he'd been incontinent of feces. During that admission, he developed somatic delusions about having cancer. His ADLs continued to be very poor, and he began to smear feces. With IPCC support, he was discharged in November 1995 and placed in a rest home because he required a high level of care and supervision of his ADLs. Mr. A attends activities at the community-based IPCC day program 3 days per week. His speech is tangential and irrelevant at times, but he will usually cooperate if given explicit directions. Despite the fact that Mr. A has been able to live outside the hospital for the past 2 years, he remains very dependent on the rest home and IPCC staff for all his needs, and smearing feces continues to be a problem. Let's take a second and give a symptom severity score. Follow along on the chart. Just start out looking at the descriptions and the clinical examples and see where you think you would fall in terms of symptom severity. Okay, if everybody has a score there, let's take a look at level of functioning. Same thing, look at your description, look at your clinical examples, and see where you think Mr. A fits.
Oh, smooth species, I didn't see that. Smooth species.
His level of functioning is close to lower.
Okay, now pick the lowest of symptom severity and level of functioning, and that's going to be your GAF score. So take a look at those two scores, take the lowest one, and that'll be your GAF score. Somebody tell me what kind of scores you have. At least a couple people read off your scores, other than John, who obviously knows the answer to this one.
In Miami, we're thinking his GAF is about 12.
Okay. Somebody else? 15? Okay.
Yeah, Columbus would say about, I'd say about 10.
10?
17.
17.
West LA says 11.
11. Somebody else?
Bingo.
17.
17. Okay, let's go back and take a look. And somebody who had the 11, what were you looking at for level of functioning?
Smearing feces.
The continued smearing of feces on level of function.
Okay. How about for symptom severity? Did anybody score him up a little higher on symptom severity?
Yeah. I'll give him a 25.
We're off the phone.
C.
Okay, and what was the basis for your score?
Delusions and
What did she give him?
25.
Okay, so he another thing to look at with Mr. A is obviously the level of structure that he has. If you're talking a GF somewhere here that we have in the range of 11 to 20, let's say this is somebody who could be in a hospital, but he's being maintained outside of a hospital with an intensive case management program. So he's able to stay out, but he requires a lot of supervision to maintain personal hygiene, and you can see that reflected in the level of functioning. Somebody in 11 to 20 frequently fails to maintain minimal self-care, personal hygiene, so he certainly fits there. He's got the smearing feces. He's doing that.
Level of functioning is symptom severity.
and we know something there about a little bit, not too much, but something. It continues to be a problem. It was a problem in the past, continues to be. How about symptom severity? On that, he's got speech tangentially irrelevant, and if we look up on the top, we've got some gross impairment in communication, fits in there, impairment in judgment.
You're breaking up a bit, George.
I'm sorry. Delusions, impairment in judgment are also factors in that range. The score that he got, in fact, from Brockton was a 20. So most people who are responding are a little bit lower than a 20. I think the rationale for the 20 probably comes from the fact that this guy is, in fact, living in the community. He's attending the day program regularly, so he's got a little bit. He requires supervision, plenty of supervision. But the fact that he's been outside the hospital for the past 2 years, I think would argue for him to be closer to the top of the range. So the score of 20 makes some kind of sense there. His symptom severity actually would probably be the higher element here. He's got the delusions, but the level to which they're interfering with his daily functioning is probably not quite as great as for somebody in the 11 to 20 area. Does that make sense? Would people go with the 20 for this guy? Sure, why not? Okay.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think one of the issues in that particular vignette was the conditions around which species were being smeared, and whether it was a manipulative thing or it had to do with some other aspects of regression on his part. I mean, that would have a big factor just in terms of whether you were rating it up or down.
No, I agree at the level of functioning was exactly
right, and how often he's doing it, the kind of situations.
Not by how bad they can
and we don't know quite that from the example, but that's probably the best we can get out of that. You can only go so far with the example because you have a limited amount of information. And when you're actually doing your GAF score, and you have some more things available from observation and interview that you can use.
This is Columbus. I have a question.
Yes.
If he was in a hospital and was doing the same things, what was your rating?
For me, I'd go lower then. Knowing that he's in the hospital, I would assume that part of the reason he's in the hospital is because he couldn't make it outside, so he'd probably be closer to the lower end of the range.
Okay.
Because I place a lot of emphasis on the fact that he's able to function in the community, requires some structure, but he is able to function out there. Let's take a look at number 9.
Because we got a whole bunch of kids in a nursing home that's functioning.
This is Mr. H. I'll read through Mr. H for you. Mr. H is a divorced veteran in his early 50s who served 2 tours in Vietnam. Shortly after his discharge, he committed and was convicted of a violent crime for which he served a full 10-year sentence. He declined parole. After being released, he was able to keep jobs for only limited periods of time, despite his considerable skills as a carpenter, due to his alcohol dependence. He committed several burglaries to meet his monetary needs. A progressive judge, recognizing the special needs of Vietnam vets, remanded him for treatment at a local VA. Mr. H is currently 100% service-connected for PTSD, chronic, suffers from intense re-experiencing phenomena, flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, and nightmares so horrific as to make sleep aversive. The veteran suffers from constant irritability secondary to insomnia, angers easily, has extremely poor impulse control, and frequently experiences dissociative episodes during which the environment and people around him are at risk for severe damage or injury. He lives in a trailer in a sparsely populated area. His social withdrawal is so marked that he's forced to grocery shop at all-night supermarkets to avoid contact or conflict with people. He's phobic to crowds, and his interpersonal contact is limited almost exclusively to 3 times per week sessions with his therapist. Mr. H has had numerous extended psychiatric hospitalizations, but thanks to aggressive medication management and intensive psychotherapy, has not required an inpatient admission in the last 3 years. Okay, take a look at the scale again and look for symptom severity. Look at the description. Look at the clinical examples and see where you think Mr. H would fit.
There's one about crowds.
Okay, do the same thing for level of functioning.
40.
Take a look at the description, clinical examples, and see where he would fit on the scale. Also keeping in mind the treatment parameters, basically the living situation, the kind of treatment environment that he's in. Now take a look at your symptom severity score and your level of functioning score. Pick the lowest of those two, and that's going to be your GAF. Okay, could some people give me some GAFs for Mr. H?
San Francisco, I'd say 16.
16. Somebody else?
He's in the hospital.
I had 25 and 25.
Okay.
40.
So you're going to choose 25. Somebody else?
Miami, one of us chose 20 and another chose 28.
28? Okay.
Oh, what we said.
20 and 25.
Wow. I take that back.
I just think some of this you could almost define as coping, and it's worth noting this guy is living out there, so
Yeah.
I'd rate it more like a 43 to 47.
Okay.
How about we're split
47?
well, 45 and 50.
45 and 50, okay.
I'd probably give him a higher 30s for the fact that he's still pretty disturbed by some of his symptoms.
35.
That sounds like a 37.
You know?
Okay.
5.
What was the last one?
52.
52? Okay, let's go back and take a look. For symptom severity, what's the first thing? Yeah, aside from symptom severity and level of functioning, what do we know about Mr. H? What's the big thing that sticks out of Mr. H's history?
He's potentially dangerous.
No, that's not it. The thing that sticks out of his history is he's 100% service-connected for PTSD.
Better keep him below 35.
That immediately tells us that somebody considered him to be below 35.
So see, I was right the first time.
So we've got to, in
31.
thinking about rating him, we've now got to really take a close look at anything over 35 to see if we're not maybe missing something. For his symptom severity, somebody mentioned. I think some of the high scores here are coming from the fact that he is coping. He is making it. He's been out of the hospital. He hasn't had the admission in the last 3 years. So he's out there, but his functioning is fairly
That's not
strict.
functioning very well to me.
He has to shop at night, so there's a
shopping at night. You know what I mean?
his ability to function
It's really bad to me.
is pretty limited.
Social withdrawal.
And this starts to bring him down on the scale. But he does cope, he does manage. So level of functioning, what we've looked at this guy is that his level of functioning, we're agreeing with the people that are having the higher ratings. And we looked at him between 31 and 40, that he was somewhere in that range. Now, in terms of his symptom severity, there he's got a number of PTSD symptoms that are current.